Hey, welcome back everybody. Professor Wills here. We wanted to continue now with our examination of the art and architecture of ancient Greece. For this mini lecture, we're going to be focusing on Grecian sculpture. And what we find characteristic of the Greek culture is a fascination with the human body. We've talked about how their Greek gods and goddesses took the form of the humans themselves. We're not seeing composites or hybrids of half animal, half human, or all animal gods, like we might have seen in Egypt, for instance. There is perhaps aligned with the whole celebration of fitness, the Olympic Games, which was a Greek invention, a whole obsession on the human body, that you find part of the very fast evolution of the description of the body in Greek art, particularly sculpture, that is extremely naturalistic. These are physiques, particularly described in the male nudes that proliferated in their culture. Women were usually clothed, but nevertheless, you find an accuracy in proportions, naturalism. The body slowly starts to behave in its description that's subtly complex yet relaxed. So what we're going to do today is examine early Greek sculpture as well as Archaic period sculpture. And you'll see within a few decades, maybe a couple centuries, the movement towards naturalism will evolve by leaps and bounds, and that is so different than what we saw in ancient Egypt. All right, without further ado, let's get to that PowerPoint. All right, here I am with our PowerPoint here. We'll start off a while ago at 700 BCE with a little bronze sculpture called Mantiklos Apollo. Again, the medium is bronze, about 8 inches in height. You can see there are some elements missing, a right arm, some of the lower legs, but nevertheless, you can see that this statue is kind of concurrent with the period of the geometric period in Greek pottery. And when you think about it, this guy has a lot of geometric shapes to him. His triangular shaped torso, this sort of a long, unnaturalistic, elongated kind of conical neck. He's got a long kind of coiled hairstyle that would have been the taste of that time as well. Simplistic facial features, and legs that likely tapered into more narrower lower calves and feet that unfortunately are no longer attached. What you find, though, with this figure's left arm is a bent elbow and a fist, and scholars believe that this figure likely held a bow, as in bow and arrow, and signifying that this was probably the god Apollo, as that was his attribute. Apollo being the son of the patriarch of the pantheon of Greek gods and goddesses, Zeus. Apollo was the god of music and light. Of course, the bow is now missing as well. What you find also that helps give a clue about this particular sculpture is there is writing on it. So an inscription describes that a man named Mantiklos, as you see in the title here, dedicated this sculpture to the god Apollo, and likely that is, a way, like we saw with the statuettes of worshippers in Sumer, to hope for some kind of benevolence, a favor granted back, that kind of thing. So this is an early clue, of course, about the much popular veneration of the Olympian gods, in this case Apollo. But you still see sort of the legacy of strong geometric forms here, but there is just a little bit of a baby step towards naturalism, towards an artisan who observed the human anatomy, and you can see that in the torso. where you have subtle incised lines that delineate the abdominal muscles and the pectoral muscles as well. So it's baby steps, we're getting there, but let me show you what I have next. So this is sort of our benchmark to see how things were in the year 700 BCE. Moving on to our next sculpture here, we have our first period taking us officially from the year 600 to 480 BCE. That is called the Archaic period. And this statue is called Kouros from Attica. Sometimes it's called the New York Kouros because you can see it at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. It dates from about a century later, circa 600 BCE. And Kouros means youth. So you can see it's an unbearded, clean-shaven look of somebody of a younger, not quite a child age, but more like a young man. That is what a kouros is. So this is a sculpture, not in bronze, but in marble. And we know that in ancient Greece, as we saw in the Aegean, there are abundant reserves of marble for them to sculpt and to construct their temples, which we'll study as well. This figure I would call life-size, about a little over 6 feet in height. So what I'm going to do is take myself away here because it is worth doing a little bit of a compare and contrast to where we left off with figurative sculpture in Egypt. And of course, you might remember Mikuri and his wife from the Old Kingdom era in Egypt. This funerary statue has some things that you can find to compare and contrast with our kouros. First of all, of course, the frontal presentation. You see that seems to have rubbed off on the archaic Greeks at this point in their early archaic period. Arms bound to the side, that's something we see in both of them as well. And yes, you're right. You see that foot slid forward. We talked about that in class. This is something that the ancient Egyptians did as well, as a means by which to not necessarily show a walking movement, but to imply a little bit of liveliness in the behavior of the human body. It's a little stiff looking still though, right? We see that the Egyptians kept those knees locked, as do the ancient Greeks as well. So it's almost like your foot sliding forward on a piece of ice or something like that. So it's not really the naturalistic behavior, so to speak, of the human body. If you were to take a step forward, you would probably have a bit of a bend to both knees as you propel your body. But this shows that, you know, across the Mediterranean, we see some influence, surprisingly, and maybe not surprisingly, from Egypt as well. What's different? What do you notice that's different? Well, we're not looking at a pharaoh. That's one thing. What we're finding here is a young man without any clothes on. So this is the beginning of what would later be known as called the heroic nude type. The Greeks, as I talked about, celebrated the human body, you know, through the Olympic Games, through their, you know, the gods that took human form, but also when it comes to the depiction of males, you often find them rendered in the nude. And there was pride in that. There was no shame in that. And so you see that being quite a stark difference between what we saw in Egypt and what you see here in archaic period Greece. So this is a statue. One thing they do have in common is a funerary purpose, whereas in Egypt, funerary statues of pharaohs served as a backup host for the ka in case something should corrupt or damage the pharaoh's mummy. Here in archaic period Greece, these served as grave markers, almost like very large headstones for early Grecian cemeteries. All right, let's move on here. What you can also find too is compared to Mantiklos Apollo, we're starting to get rid of that rigid geometry. We're not seeing a torso necessarily strictly triangular. We're starting to see a softening of it to describe the muscles, the tapering of the waistline. and details delineating the muscle groups, kneecaps, etc. But by the time we get so here we are in the year 600, moving on to about 4 decades later, the year 560 BCE, we have a remarkable sculpture called the Calfbearer. So I'll come back to here, say hello again. What I have on the right is a photo of the Calfbearer dating from 560 BCE, another example of a marble Archaic period Greek sculpture measuring about 5.5 feet here. So what we have is not a kouros, though. You can see that this figure wears a beard, so it's an older man, and on his shoulders is a young calf. What you find, of course, with this particular figure here is even more of a physicality that's believable, less geometric, right? We're starting to see the roundness of the shoulder muscles, the biceps, I mean, even more of a delineation of the abdominal muscles, the navel, swelling, but, you know, a description that almost fools the eye. Even though this is marble, you get a sense of a mix of firm musculature forming that thigh, but, you know, a suppleness to the flesh in the marble as well. The Calfbearer is an interesting sculpture because it too has an inscription that tells us a little bit about it. And this description states that a man named Rhombus dedicated this statue to the goddess Athena, who you may have heard of. She's the goddess of wisdom and warfare. We'll talk a lot about her when we get to the Parthenon, the famous Greek temple in Athens. But the dedication basically is a way of expressing thanksgiving for Rhombus's prosperity. So he's crediting Athena for his good fortune and prosperity. And that calf is a gift, likely meant as a sacrifice, just to let you know. So don't fall too in love with its doe-eyed expression here. But what I do want to point out here is not only this increasing naturalism of the human body within a very short span of decades in Archaic period Greece, but also what you find is this incredible kind of X-shaped design where the legs of the animal blend with the forearms of the Calfbearer himself. I mean, that's a really much more of an elevated design choice than we've ever seen before. Finally, something that's associated with the Archaic period is something called the Archaic smile. So you might notice the difference between this statue and our earlier ones is this one seems to have a subtle closed smile to his mouth. You can see it a little bit better in this close-up here. Now, it's not meant to be like a ha ha ha, that's so funny smile. It's meant to enliven the figure, bring life to it a little bit more. So it can be deceptive. We're going to see the Archaic smile employed in more serious contexts where it seems a little bit off, but it's something that is a characteristic of sculpture at this point in Archaic period Greece. All right, one more sculpture for you. This is Croesus from the year 530 BCE. Croesus is called this. It is a kouros. You can see it's an unshaven young man because it too has a dedication on it. And more or less, it delineates that poor Croesus, who was a real person, died in battle. And poor Ares supposedly destroyed him one day as he fought in the foremost ranks. So it means he was, on the vanguard. He was fighting in the front. So this served as a grave marker as well. It's another marble statue measuring about 6 feet 4 inches, and you can still see paint on it. So keep in mind, these sculptures were painted, but look how, with that, other than that Archaic smile, what you see is incredible naturalism. But still that foot slid forward and the arms bound to the side. But we're going to get away from that soon. Thanks.